Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Neil. Okay, we have about 25 minutes, so I'm going to ask Dearbhail and Gary to just respond in about 5 minutes to John's paper, and then we might open it to the floor. So, Dearbhail.
Okay, yeah, thank you very, very much, and to the Iveagh family and to Glencree, it's an absolute honour to be part of this inaugural conversation. In my day job, I'm the business editor of independent newspapers, and I've tried really, really hard not to look at Brexit through the lens of my youth, which is growing up in the border. My mum is from Dundalk, my dad's from Newry, and we grew up in the shadow of one of the biggest British Army bases, which you'll all be familiar with, the Pollak Army base, that tract of land between Newry and Dundalk known as Ball Valley. And it's hard to describe in words the impact of growing up during the conflict in Northern Ireland, and also the impact of the border on our lives, and to see one of the biggest changes in that time. I wrote an op-ed a couple of weeks ago in which I said it's hard to describe the interdependence of lives and livelihoods in border areas, the seamless way families and workers traverse invisible lines, once peppered with roadblocks and obstacles, physical and psychological. And for me, the border is many, many, many things we traverse week in, week out because of our family connections. The border is history, the border is geography, the border is demography, which is going to play a very important part as the centenary of the birth of Northern Ireland approaches. It was a very, very physical thing for us, but at heart it was a psychological thing. And really to see the big change in my lifetime, to see those borders come down, not just the physical borders, but the psychological borders. And, you know, John, there's no subtlety or suppleness or subtlety about the current kind of Brexit talks. And sometimes people don't understand just how deep that those changes are. I take my nieces and nephews, we drive across the border from time to time, and I try and explain to them what it was like, and they have no concept, you know, thank God. And I look back and I have images of the British soldiers who now, when I look back, were young and terrified, and I have very, very visceral memories of that. But I look back at, you know, what we've achieved and what we haven't achieved in the last 20 years in the Good Friday Agreement, because it seems to me what we've achieved is a negative peace characterised by the absence of violence, which is critical. We need that. But we haven't yet transversed into a positive peace, which is characterised by true integration. And we see that, and I'm sure Gary will see this, in our education system, which 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement, 9 out of 10 of our school children are educated in segregated schools. Ditto for social housing policy. But we were getting there in many, many respects. One of the sort of ephemeral things about the Good Friday Agreement was that agreed island that John Hume spoke at. I'm allergic to the term United Ireland in many respects, but we were sort of getting there. You look at business indicators. In the last 15 years, 50% of hotel stock in Northern Ireland was created. Like if ever there was a dividend from peace, in the last 15 years, 50% of our hotel stock in Northern Ireland. And I look at some of the unspoken things of the Good Friday Agreement, one of the most important things around identity. When I was growing up, the name Dearbhail was a bit of a giveaway. Our parents had fairly marked us out from Barford side of the fence. We might be Dearbhail from Newry. But I look back when I was 13 or 14, and I'd always identified as an Irish person. But I couldn't have said what I can say now, which is that I'm actively Irish and passively British. Now that fluidity around identity, it doesn't matter if you're British, Irish, neither or both, and people don't understand the intrinsic value of that. And for me, just to finish up, what Brexit has done, it has accelerated a debate that may have been happening by virtue of demography or other factors, but it's done so in a really, really dangerous way, because I feel that our neighbours across the side of the Irish Sea have kicked us about like a political football and have forgotten that visceral fear that we have. When I hear that there are 600 people going to be applied by customs, I shudder in fear, because we know that some of the first shots of the customs of the Troubles were shot across that. And I look at, you know, the way things were generically coming along in a great way, and I think that subtlety has been lost. They don't understand our fear, and they don't understand the importance of that fluidity around identity. You know, a lot of our, you know, border counties have already felt the full force of Brexit. Some of our businesses have not even recovered from that first appreciation. And I look to the future now, and what worries me is that some of the socio-economic conditions that not quite gave birth but contributed to the beginning of troubles are backstalking Northern Ireland, and that some of those entrenched views are coming back, and it's a new generation that's being radicalised by them that perhaps have no direct memory of it. And that piece and that agreed island piece is very important. And unfortunately, and I'll conclude with this, for me it is impossible not to disagree with, it's actually a commentary by Duncan Morrow from the University of Ulster. He said that despite all of the uncertainties of Brexit, there is one thing that we can be absolutely sure of, that Northern Ireland, in its current guise and current form and current vulnerability, cannot deal with one of two scenarios. One is United Ireland and one is a hard Brexit. Unless and until those conversations are successfully managed, just like we had in advance of the marriage referendum, just as we had in advance of the recent referendum. And that's where places like Glencree come in, because when I think back to growing up, there were safe spaces in which we have to have conversations and to be safe around that. And they have to be neutral spaces. And if we don't have that conversation, there are three of us in this panel who, in our own way, have committed our lives in journalism to story. And it is all about story. I think the 1916 commemorations were successfully handled because of story. And I think that if we don't pay attention to that, there's a risk of a return to violence, there's a risk of a hard border, and that, even if we get a 50+1, any prospect of that risk of a return is too high a price to say. And just like your late mother, we have to prevent another generation from suffering.
Thank you.
John, thank you for your lecture. It was excellent. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, I very much was shaped by that Protestant unionist loyalist tradition. That's what I was born into. My grandfather fought against the Turks at the Dardanelles. My uncle Jimmy was rescued at Dunkirk and went in on the second day of D-Day. My grandfather came back from the First World War and formed an Orange Lodge. My dad was in the lodge. My uncles were in the lodge. That was my tradition. That's how I was shaped, through no fault of my own, as a human being. But the day I describe myself, I'm British, I'm Irish, I have an Irish passport, I have a British passport. And in relation to the Good Friday Agreement, I voted yes. I voted to remain. I think Brexit is a disaster, as someone from that unionist tradition. And I think we're going to feel the shockwaves of that for a long, long time, and there is no simple solution to that. As Dearbhail has said, I'm completely committed to storytelling. I spent my life most weeks. In fact, this week I will spend 4 days in Dublin and 3 days in Belfast, facilitating stories between our different traditions, to use that phraseology. Gus Scally, a scholar, says that, science has proven that storytelling is the most effective mechanism for bringing about change. And he uses that little phrase that we all remember as children when your mum or dad or granny or granda sat at your bedside and used that little phrase, once upon a time. And I'm going to suggest that all of us in this room, both north and south, that we need more once upon a time moments. I want to hear Dearbhail's story of what it was like to grow up in those watchtowers of the Brits looking down on her. But I want to tell my story of what it was like as a young kid born into the Troubles, in what was a reasonably mixed area, seeing Catholics removed from my street and then Protestants removed from streets that weren't that far away. We still need to hear those stories. As regards Brexit, a friend of mine kind of teasingly said, and I play about a little bit with this around the principle of consent, which I signed up for. But the 51-49 in the Good Friday Agreement, if we were to move that way today, I'm not convinced will work. Any more than I'm convinced that the 52 versus 48 in Brexit is going to work. As a colleague of mine said, to change the Constitution of Oxford University, you need 75%. And here are us Egypts in the UK making the biggest constitutional change in living memory, with a very tiny, tiny percentage. 25 years' time, maybe 51-49 might work, with more of those stories and that engagement and that reconciliation and that human encounter has taken place. I would counsel strongly against the border poll at the moment that would go 51-49. I'd be interested to hear wider conversation around that. Maybe when I'm dead, it may work. Today, it's too raw. It's too painful. As well as Brexit, and we'll talk a little bit about this, I mean, the legacy issue is still toxic. How we deal with the power of memory. I will never, ever do another PhD, but I often say, Dearbhail, if I did, I would do it on the power of memory, how we tell our stories. And I'll just tell a story and then we'll open it up. I'll pass back to Andy. I remember as a 6-year-old little boy being taken every darn year when I was a kid to watch the Orange Men on the Lisburn Road on the 12th of July. And I often remember this banner of 1641, graphically painted, of the Protestants up to their necks in water and the Catholics about to push them onto the water and drown those Protestants. Now, what impact that had on me as a 6-year-old, I don't actually know. I was too young to understand psychology or theology or sociology, but I do know this. As a little boy standing in the Lisburn Road, I realised, Gary, you can't trust those Catholics, the drowned Protestants. But as soon as I grew up, I realised there was another 6-year-old boy on the other side of the fence. And he was seeing his banners of Cromwell, the Lord Protector, sweeping through southern Ireland, ramming spears through the chests of Catholics. And his narrative was, you can't trust Protestants. They stick spears into your chest. And so the way we tell our stories is absolutely powerful. And we need to find a space, a mechanism to ensure we hear our stories much better. David Reef, the USA journalist, wrote a book there a number of years ago entitled In Praise of Forgetting. And he was not talking about some form of shameful amnesia. But he was saying this, we need to do memory a lot better. The Skenos project that I spearheaded for a number of years was a £21 million sort of post-conflict urban village. I stepped back from that a few years ago, as a number of folk know, to form Rethinking Conflict. But just across from my office, every darn day, I looked out at this mural of graphic headlines of Le Mans, Birmingham bombings, Hyde Park, telling me in those graphic headlines what the other did to me, never what my side did to the other. But the strapline above those front newspaper pages was this: the price of peace is eternal vigilance. What it really means is, always keep an eye on the scum on the other side. You can't trust them. So how do we create more spaces, be it Brexit, Good Friday Agreement, parades, whatever, that we hear each other? I mean, the Jewish theologian Michel once said, dehumanization precedes genocide. And we've had this amazing ability on this island for centuries to dehumanize the other person.
I just want to say, Gary, I just want to say about things that lodge in your memory when you're very, very young. So one of them that I have, and I've written but never published, a short story, a piece of flash fiction on it, which I haven't published, but it's called, and I've never said this, but it's called The Red Light. And it's about one of my earliest memories of the back roads in South Armagh when there was the tailbacks, whether customs and security on a good day or if there's something tragic, you had to go the back roads. And late at night, and many of you will have probably seen this, but a red light would come out. And the red light would be circling. And that red light would be telling you to slow down. And I always remember in an instant, there were the four of us in the back of the car. And when I look back now, my parents were quite young. They were in their early 30s, probably at that stage. And the atmosphere in the car would change immediately. Because you did not know at the end of that red light, was it the IRA? Was it the UVF? Was it the RUC? Was it something else? And just how quickly that would change. And sometimes your parents had to make a decision. As you approach that red light, do you stop or do you go through it? And these were like, big things. And I kind of think, now there's a specific road, and I family live out in South Armagh. There are certain roads that to this day I will not drive in my own late at night. Because I have that memory. And it's visceral, and sometimes moves me to tears, you know, even, and when I think of, you know, what's at stake and seeing a lot of the political buffoonery around Northern Ireland and it being used, and I think it's fair to say that Northern Ireland's been weaponised by so many sides in this debate. And to answer your question, what do? I think we have to go back to the things that unite us. But we have to go back to a place where we can share those stories, and the failure to deal with so many issues, including legacy, is acting as a severe brake on allowing us to move forward. And sometimes I worry, John, in reference to partition and the way we frame that, sometimes I worry, is it too late? Is it too late for it? Is there a big them and us between the north and the south? You know, sometimes in the north we say, do they understand us? Do they get us? You know, if there was a referendum for a united Ireland, if, you know, down the line, border polls, whatever, sometimes we think, would they take us down the south? And people say, of course we would. And then we say, well, no, we might give up the NHS. The Catholics would rather keep that. But it's interesting just to see the long tail of that. And I do believe that story is one of the ways to understand the other. I look at young loyalists now, and I think, you know, really those automatic routes to Bombardier, to Harland, to Wolf and everything. When you look at who is educationally disadvantaged in Northern Ireland now, it is disproportionately affecting young members of the Protestant community. And the nationalist and the Catholic tradition have to be able to look over those walls and actually see where is the real disadvantage. And I think the job of media, and I think we've been quite remiss in this, is actually to bring people over to the other side and stand in the shoes of the other. And that, I think, is one way to try and help resolve it. Brexit has been profoundly unhelpful.
Okay, thank you from the panel for the moment. It's over to you. Questions to either John or to the other members of the panel. Maybe you just say who you are.
My name is Anne.
There's a microphone.
My name is My name is Anne Travers, and I was born in Belfast in 1969, and I lived a lovely life. Really, my parents protected me as much as they possibly could from the Troubles. I have lots of memories that of the checkpoints, bomb scares. As the youngest of 6 children, I remember my parents bringing us down for a trip to Dublin. Mum wanted to go to Cleary's for some reason. I must have been about 7. And my dad, and my mum, my sister, and my brothers went on ahead into the shop, and Dad came back to me. I was standing at the doors. He said, "Anne, what's wrong?" And I said, "I'm waiting to be searched, Daddy," and I had my arms out. And I think he was taken aback. On the 8th of April 1984, like Una Higgins O'Malley, my father was attacked by the IRA walking home from Mass. With my sister and my mother. My dad was shot 6 times, and he survived. My sister was shot once in the back and was killed. And the same gunman held a gun to my mother's head, pulled the trigger twice, but the gun jammed. Dad's crime was that we were Catholics. He was a resident magistrate. Mary's crime was that she was a primary school teacher over in Andersonstown, and my mum's crime, well, she was married to my dad. So that was at the time. I was 14 years of age. It was 200 yards from our house, and suddenly the Troubles were very much in my backyard, and it changed my life forever. But I now live in County Wicklow. I work as an advocacy support worker for a victims group in Lisnaskea. And we support victims and survivors of the Troubles, both here in the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland and in the UK. And I agree with you completely about legacy and Brexit. And I just wonder, how are we going to build up that trust, Gary, like you spoke about? I wonder what reconciliation is without acknowledgement that men and women had the right to go out and do a job and the right to life. And I also wonder how we will ever deal with Brexit as cross-border workers. But I think that we do need to kind of build up an understanding with each other. And I feel that victims, John, you mentioned about the 1998 agreement And while, yes, it was great and that we have this peace, victims were left out of that agreement, and actually that is where there is a lot of trouble now. Because until victims are acknowledged and listened to, properly listened to, I don't believe that the legacy issues will go away anytime soon.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask John a question while you think about the question. John, you talked about the importance of interdependence. And since the Good Friday Agreement, one could say the interdependence between North and South has advanced in great strides, much more so than the recognition of mutual independence, interdependence within Northern Ireland. Now this is terribly threatened by Brexit. How do you see that necessary, vital interdependence between North and South, the people of North and South, continuing in the post-Brexit period?
Well, I think it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to maintain anything like the level of rapport, mutual interest, collegiality, as I said. I think this has been spelled out very tellingly by Peter Robinson in his paper to McGill Summer School. And I think the manner in which that eventually was reported, because of one comment which was not, it was an interesting comment, but it was not why he went there to speak. And what he had to say was extraordinarily important. It's online. I think it's online. I know it's online under Glencree's, and it's also on your blog substantially, isn't it?
And it's also Tommy
Gorman
in our
TEG blog, yeah.
Has a long blog about
a long blog, but I actually don't think that it was reported in the newspapers.
No, it wasn't.
Well, that's astonishing. I thought I missed it. Extraordinary, because it spells out, and really what's so depressing about Brexit is that this is what must happen. In other words, the individuals who were necessarily lobbying for, say, the Republic's interest and somebody else for the UK interest or North, South, whatever, that they found themselves capable of making a pragmatic compromise, but they weren't broadly doing the same thing. Now they must be doing something different because the rules are going to change. Complicated, of course, by this 56%. That must be worth. I think the 40. I keep saying to myself when I watch this all the time, what about the? I'm amazed that it doesn't come up more often. The 48% vote. And I think people who are in Britain are quite a little bit confused. They're using the word, ever since the Florida election and the hanging shafts, which we all remember, as to whether this was going to determine who the next president would be. People now use the phrase, this is a decisive vote, when all it is a decisive result. It's not a decisive referendum just by any means. The 48% are worth something, and that's why you get majority. By the way, the other big thing about referenda is that the biggest question of all is, the majority. I think there is a real argument, of course, for 50%. But equally, a weighted majority, or a proportion of the electorate, is another way, in case it's a very, very good turnout. These are also mechanisms that are used. But the big one is just this ignoring of the 48%, as if they hardly counted. And if we, and I think this has been said by the other panelists, this whole notion that the Good Friday Agreement has this mechanism to unite Ireland by 50% plus one. If it was ever attempted to deliver on that, and it is, the governments are enjoined by the agreement to deliver it, that 50% plus one, if it was that narrow, that's going to be spatially different on either side of the river. Big time. It's going to be a much more unionist, 3 counties on one side, much more unionist. And so that's going to be fraught with difficulty, and that will not be. We've got to agree on Ireland before we ever think of uniting Ireland. And when we unite it, we need to unite it almost, the border needs to melt away, not to be bombed away. I mean, the people who frontal pressure hardens borders. If people don't want a hard border, why would they bomb it for 30 years? Because that's what hardens borders. You know that.
But I think the tragedy of Brexit is that the border was melting away before Brexit because of the Good Friday Agreement. You had this miraculous situation where the border was disappearing without the constitutional position changing. So the Unionists could feel secure in the unchanging constitutional position, and the Nationalists could feel happy because there was no border anymore. It was one of those rare win-win situations in the North. So there's a gentleman here, yeah.
Thank you, Andy, and I agree with that last point you made. And thank you, John. I'd like to join with Polish to congratulate you on an excellent paper. I have to declare my interest here first because Kevin O'Kelly is my name. I'm a member of the Glencree Centre. But my grandfather was the Director of Elections for the constituencies in Ulster during in the 1918 elections. And he was elected as an independent Republican in Armagh in the first Stormont elections. And you actually quote him quite substantially in your book, which I've read with great interest a number of times. I had a couple of points to make, Andy, if you don't mind. First of all, as regards the Punch cartoon, I think there was much more to the discussions around where the border would be. And Carson was pushed by some of his delegation, and also by Lloyd George. I've discussed this with Eamon Phoenix, actually, who's done some research into it, that Ulster should not be divided, that Ulster should stand as an entity. But Carson was very concerned about that because it would give a 50-50 or close to 50-50 split, and he wanted a 70-30 majority. An Ulster, Protestant Ulster for Protestant people, or whatever the quote was. I'm trying to remember, Andy, you may remember there was a book published a few years ago by a BBC correspondent at Belfast where he interviewed a number of key...
Alternative Ulsters.
Absolutely, yes. And in that, Ian Paisley Sr. actually was very critical of Carson for not taking the whole of Ulster when it was offered. So it's just a point you might like to comment on. I'd just like to say too that when I studied economics in the concert hall around the corner here, I had a lecturer who was very animated in the early 1960s, that sort of gives away my age, about the Treaty of Rome. He was supposed to be teaching us at a tutorial statistics, but he got very animated about the Treaty of Rome, and he said, and it more or less changed my view because it was brought up in a very much discussions around partition and the North and that the Treaty of Rome and the European Economic Community would do away with the border in Ireland, and that's the point you were just making a few minutes ago, Andy, and I think that's very true. That was Garrett Fitzgerald. I don't know if anybody remembers him, but anyway. So 2 points I'd like to make. Nobody's mentioned the demographic shift that's taken place slowly in the last 50 years. And that's having an impact, I think, on the unionist mentality. John, you might like to maybe comment on that. And secondly, Dearbhail, I can remember actually a few years, maybe a few decades older than you, driving in my father's car, in the back of my father's car, from Newry to O'Meath, and be special stopping it with the red light. An absolutely scary situation when they stick the rifles in through the window and want to know where you're going. And I'm absolutely delighted that's gone now. And for me, Brexit was a disaster because I'm afraid of going back to those days.
Thank you. Gary, what about that feeling of the demographic divide rising in the North? The feeling that, what do the Protestants and Unionists feel about that?
Okay, I'll answer that, and I do want to pick up Anne's point as well, just to be fair to her in saying that. I mean, it's a strange almost psychological mechanism, I think, being a unionist in a sense. Because for many folk from my tradition, you're looking over the border, you're worried, do you trust these people, do you not? But then you're also looking to your friends in London, not able to trust them. So it's like being in a relationship with a brilliant woman and wondering, is she really sleeping with someone else? You know, and that's almost the irony of it, the whole concept of trust. So, I mean, I would ask those, you know, here within the South, to look at those within the Unionist family. There is a fear there. There's an awful lot of uncertainty. The Conservatives have never been great friends of Ulster Unionists. They have played them off when it suits them, and in a few years' time, that could change again, as we all know. And yet we look to the South, or a few days' time, if the truth be told, and yet we look to the South and people wonder in relation to that. And I often say this to Republicans, many whom I work very, very closely with, that I know within the worldview of republicanism, border polls are important. But I remember saying to a very leading Republican a couple of years ago, in fact, Pat Hines, my colleague and friend, was with me and saying, and they didn't listen, could you just park border polls until we get Brexit over and then begin that conversation? Because introducing that into Brexit has actually soured relationships even more. So I don't think republicanism was wise in using that. I know all the dynamics about intergroup consensus, keeping your support base on board, making sure the hawks don't go back to war, etc., etc., etc. It's a finely tuned machine, as is loyalism, but I just don't think it's helping the situation. And in relation to legacy, here is my concern. Okay, many of us have made submissions. I was involved with the church in making a submission. I'm assuming the report will spill out late winter, early spring. What are they going to do with it? If the Assembly is not back up and running, here is my concern. The British government will kick it down the road for another 6 months. And if the Assembly is not up and running, where does it go? So I think some of us need to be not just putting pressure on politicians, but also asking the difficult question, are politicians the best people to deal with the issue of legacy? Should it be passed to some group within civic society, with some politicians part of that grouping? But my concern is it will just become another political football, as it has for decades, and we'll be having this conversation winter 2019.
So can I just say, just on that, in my role, I support victims within responses to the legacy consultation, and I also, you know, I would write letters to the PSNI, to the guards, to whoever victims want me to ask questions of. And actually, my colleagues and myself, it's just not just our group, every other victims group in Northern Ireland, the replies, the letters, the standard reply they get back from the PSNI for the most part is that they're not dealing with anything, basically, until legacy comes about. There's no answers for victims. People are getting older. You know, I've one lady who's in her 80s who's, you know, she's not in good health, and she just wants to know what happened to her son, or, you know. So I think that's really important, Gary, and I think you make a really good point. The Northern Ireland office has told us it'll take about 2 years, but I mean, I agree with you. It's shameful, actually. And I think I'm sorry that the minister has gone, because I do think it's quite shameful how politicians have reacted. And here in the south, where we've got victims here, in Dublin, Monaghan bombings, as well as other individuals, they have got no access to legacy, as in the Stormont House Agreement.
Dearbhail, do you want to respond to Amelia's point?
Yeah, I think legacy is arguably probably the biggest challenge that we have, and much and all as it is tempting to say let's take it out of the politicians' hands, there is a criminal law dimension to it. You know, do we go for, like I look, and I'm just looking at Judge O'Malley, but I look at, you know, the reasons why I first came in, studied law and then got into journalism, and it was actually because of a fundamental belief that no matter what went wrong during the Troubles, for the most part the one thing that stayed intact actually and prevented at times anarchy between all sides was actually the rule of law. And that was a very tempting ideological thing for me as a young person. And so I think for legacy, do we opt for a South African style, you know, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or if we go for that kind of a model, like, I mean, the issue of prosecutions has kind of more or less been dealt with, but sometimes I wonder, could we handle the truth in Northern Ireland? And we're stuck between two forces of needing to move on, and yet for all of those families and for all of those victims, that accountability and trust piece. If there was a process, would people be honest within that? Would people be honest, within that process? So it's a really, really, really tricky one, and I think it is. And again, I think this is, and I don't like to get political, but what Brexit has really kind of brought forward is that when John talks about how the British and Irish governments were these custodians of the Good Friday Agreement, the way the politics has fallen in Northern Ireland, and now it's more polarised than ever before. If you look at a map of Ulster at the moment, all along the border is Green, Sinn Féin. The rest, is unionism, apart from one little flash of pink, and you just kind of look, that is so polarised now. So where is the hope for that? What sort of a mechanism would we have? And now, because of Brexit, and because of where the politics has fallen, the British government can no longer, in my view, be legitimately said to be a neutral partner in that custodian role, by virtue of the relationship it has fallen into with the DUP, and I don't think it could be a couple of years, I think it could be months or days, and the way that political dynamic could change. So it all comes back, I think, to Gary's point of who can we trust? Who can we trust to run that process? Who can we trust to go into that, and on what terms would we go into it? And I think that is why it's not just as easy as saying it's not, because the politicians do have a role, sadly, but at the minute people are compromised, and yet if we do not move, if we do not deal with that legacy, those 80-year-olds, your own family and others, you look at metrics, in I suppose business editor, you're always looking at metrics, but you look at the rate of antidepressant use in Northern Ireland relative to Western Europe and other parts of the world. Don't tell anyone that society is still not traumatised and triggered. Go back to education. It's probably one of the things I'm most passionate about 20 years later. 9 out of 10 school children. Like, how do we, get beyond that? So legacy is going to, and I just wonder where that leadership is going to come from, and it could be just one of those things, legacy, that is going to trip it up. But I tell you what, I feel guilty sometimes. I'm now 41, and I was speaking recently to Andrea Catherwood, the BBC reporter, and we were on a panel about Brexit, what else, down at the Kilkenny Festival. And the two of us were just having a chat beforehand saying, God, the two of us kind of feel a little bit of a guilt, because we love Northern Ireland. It's our home, and yet, like so many people who were educated and raised there, we chose not to have our careers and our lives there. And now as I get older, this Brexit, in my capacity as group business editor, Brexit is bringing me back home in many respects. And I go, well, am I showing leadership? What could we be doing to go back in? Because the real risk is in this generational legacy thing, is that there's an entirely young generation who have no direct memory of the Troubles, who are being radicalised. And I don't use that word lightly, but along those old sort of tribal lines. And I suppose that's where my anger, if anything, directed at what's happening in the UK. You could respect their sovereign decision if they knew what it was. If it was as clear as the Good Friday Agreement, if they knew what it was. And for me, it's kind of like, I always kind of say, looking at Brexit from this side of the Irish Sea, is that it's like your second or third cousins having a row, except the whole family breaks up. I feel so, where, and they haven't realised the impact on us. But legacy is going to be the tricky one. How do we get that balance between justice and accountability on the one hand, and the second, a society at some point needing to move on? And that is where the work of Glencree is vital. When you see people like O'Malley Higgins, when you see people like yourself that can get over those personal traumas to try and make a difference, that I think it's Archbishop Desmond Tutu says, as long as we're prisoners of hope. As long as we're prisoners of hope, that's right. And I know that's not an articulate answer, but that's the really tricky bit about legacy. It's very complicated.
Okay, now I've been told to bring it to a close, so I'm going to ask John just to say a few words, and then Barbara's going to wrap up.
First of all, I'd like to thank again those who invited me to prepare this paper. One of the points that comes very much to me is that if I were an Ulster Unionist, I wouldn't trust the British. I wouldn't. I realised that there was a phrase used a few years ago. You probably remember, Andy, who said it, that we are now with our on the finger.
Window edge of the Union.
Finger.
The window ledge.
The window ledge.
Peter Robinson.
Peter Robinson. Oh, there you are. Yeah. I normally remember these things. But anyway, I certainly remember the phrase. But it's just that it's successive British governments, if you go back over the period. The reason the British have no interest in Northern, first of all, they've signed up to the Good Friday Agreement undoubtedly, and that is a conditional union, because there is space there, and I think that's correct that there is space there for, at the moment, very unlikely, but still space for Irish people, for the people who live in the island of Ireland, to agree an Ireland that they would live together. But we'll have to wait until people are comfortable. 50% plus 1 is not going to deliver that, and not going to deliver it comfortably, and those who are loudest in looking for it soonest could well be losers. And I'll make one other final point about the other thing that really hits me all the time is we're in this together. It's our problem on this island, and it's the people of this island who together invest in their various ways. And I would not exclude the importance of last Saturday week in Lansdowne at all. I think it's hugely comforting and comfortable and sort of positive that happened. And I think, but first of all, rather like the churches and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, the Irish National Team, there are an enormous number of institutions that have survived from the 19th century to now. The Irish Union is one, but there are many, many of them. And I keep thinking that we should really stop thinking of Ireland as being either united or not united, or reunited. That's why I said, how united was Ireland before Dearbhail did its railways? Belfast is much more closely associated with the Mull of Kintyre and with before the railways, the water connected. We think the water divides because we don't have village in Ireland. But, I think that's why we need to just think all the time in the big picture of the island of Ireland and where we are, where we might be in any future. But I'd have one final point about reconciliation and so on. I was in the audience in Trinity when Cader Asmull, now no longer with us, came to give what he knew himself was not good. He knew it was going to be his last lecture in Trinity. And he was open to questions. And because he was in such an extraordinary position to comment on the question I was asking, I decided I'd ask it. And there was a lot of talk at the time about the necessity for and the benefits of having a truth commission in Northern Ireland. And I said to Cader, somebody who has 30 years' experience of Irish public law and who's a lawyer, and his own expertise came from Nuremberg. That's where he did his PhD, at Nuremberg France. I said, and from your own experience in South Africa, would you recommend a truth commission in Ireland? Would it be beneficial? And he said no. He did not do it. Didn't think in the Irish culture it would work.
Thank you, John.